Right.
So if we can get a brief
Sure.
synopsis of kind of
Okay.
growing up and.
Well, actually, I grew up in North Jersey, in Passaic, and, which then was like New Brunswick back in those days.
I was born in Patterson.
Oh, you were? Yeah. Well, you know what it was like
Right,
up there.
right.
I mean, it used to be a very vital place, and spent my school years there, and then went to Fordham University in New York, and I was actually a commuter into Fordham, and so my real first involvement with New Brunswick was at the time I graduated from Fordham. I was recruited by Johnson & Johnson, and came to work here in 1955 when I graduated school, but then had to leave. I had my commission in the Air Force, so I left for the Air Force for 3 years and came back in 1959. Actually, I had met my wife-to-be down the Jersey Shore while I was still in college, and she happened to live in East Brunswick, so it was convenient being here at J&J.
Right.
So she really saw New Brunswick all her life growing up, and I came back in 1959, as I said, to Johnson & Johnson, and lived out right here off Route 1 in the apartments, and that's really how I then spent my whole career with J&J until retiring in January 1995. So,
Could you just speak briefly about some of your positions in J&J?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had majored in accounting in undergraduate and started out as what they call an accounting trainee at Johnson & Johnson. And when I came back from the service, I was in the internal audit department and went through various areas in the financial group. Of course, Johnson & Johnson was a lot smaller company. I think when I first joined them in 1955, it was about a $240 million company, and even adjusted for inflation, the 60s, whatever is billion now, it's quite a difference. And went through the various financial departments, and I guess it was late 60s, I went out to personal products as the head of finance out there, and then in 1971 came down to corporate here as what they called the general controller, which was really the responsibility for the worldwide consolidation of Johnson & Johnson and all the reports to the executive committee internally and stockholders externally and so on. And then went up through various financial positions, and in 1976 actually was made treasurer of J&J and a member of the board of directors. And then, let's see, 1980, I guess it was, I was chief financial officer of J&J. And then moved into general management in 1983. Around 1985, J&J kind of reorganized into 3 sectors: consumer, pharmaceutical, and professional. And I was made head of the professional sector, which were the companies that develop products and marketed to primarily hospitals and physicians and things of that type. And then in 1989, I retained my responsibility as head of the professional sector, but also was made vice chairman of the board. At that time, in 1989, the current chairman, who was Jim Burke, and the current president at that time, who was Dave Clare, retired. And so the office of the chairman was set up. Ralph Larson became chairman, and a fellow by the name of Bob Wilson and I were the vice chairman of J&J. So I continued in that capacity until I retired in '95.
Thank you. Well, if we could just start with, I guess, going down the list.
Right.
It almost sounds like reporting who, what, when, where, how. I can imagine the reasons why.
Right.
But I especially would like to hear from J&J's perspective. Clearly many corporations who were in urban America just left urban America.
Right.
So maybe you can just start with some of the why from J&J's end on becoming involved with the redevelopment.
In some respects, I have to repeat what I had heard at the time, because when a lot of this started in the 60s, I was not yet at a level at Johnson & Johnson where I really was in the position of making the decisions whether to stay in New Brunswick or not stay in New Brunswick. But I'm sure John Heldrich and others, or Dick Sellers, I don't know if you've, Dick Sellers now in his 90s, so I don't know if you'll be able to speak with him.
We haven't.
But at any rate, decision was made to stay in New Brunswick. As you know, Johnson & Johnson had a lot of affiliates in different towns, surrounding area, some out in the Somerset County area, which in some respects a lot of companies were doing at that time, moving campuses and so on. It's a work campus out there. But when J&J decided they wanted to stay in New Brunswick, of course it was the original site of J&J. And that didn't come, though, without wanting some things from the state, because if at that time Route 18, for example, was dumping everybody off right here on Albany Street, and there were the pilings in the river for the John Lynch Bridge, but no bridge, and J&J felt that if we were going to stay, there had to be some quid pro quo here, and to work with the state in getting the extension made of 18 and things of that type. And but we still were in the pretty much in the original buildings. I came down to corporate in 1971, and my first real experience in terms of working with what became the redevelopment was already underway, in the sense of people working with the community and New Brunswick Tomorrow and things of that type. But I remember getting, as I said, I came in as general controller, and I remember getting a phone call from Stan Anderson, who was then the vice president of finance, saying that I'm probably going to be seeing some bills coming through from a law firm down in Philadelphia, and he wanted me to know that they were legitimate bills and such, and it had to do with the purchasing of properties at that time in the whole area surrounding Johnson & Johnson, and actually other properties in Highland Park and other places. But so that was my first experience, knowing that this thing was really underway, and we were going to eventually build a new headquarters here in town. So in the 70s, a lot of what I did in terms of working with the redevelopment initiative was kind of being the financial guy who found the money here and there. We obviously, as a company, budgeted some things, but as time goes on, different things would pop up here and there and such that weren't necessarily in the forecast. So I worked closely with John Heldrich, who was really the mover, shaker, the point person on what happened here in New Brunswick. And so John would have an idea or a discussion with somebody and come in, and we'd work out how to do that from a financial point of view. I also, at one point, I still remember going up to Boston with one of the lawyers at J&J, Glenn Miller, his name was, to work out with John Hancock Company some of the financing on what became, I believe, the first building that was redeveloped. And I think it's 300. No, it was 300 George Street. It's on the corner.
Oh, right.
On the left-hand side,
Was,
as you go past
yes.
Livingston Avenue, and it'll be on the next corner down there, and been refurbished since. But then I think there's Robert Wood is in there or something. But we did that, and then
Was it harder to get financing at that point, or just
no, it wasn't. I mean, people knew Johnson & Johnson. I mean, let's face it. One of the things that a lot of cities who would like to redevelop didn't have is a J&J. I mean, once we had made the commitment to be here, the financial resources were there, and so that obviously helped a lot in terms of anybody you spoke to about it. And while it wasn't a little amount of money that they compared to Johnson & Johnson, wasn't that huge. Some of the things we were doing. And then, for example, once they brought IMPay in terms of developing the J&J campus itself, and his concept was, I guess, a park in a city and a company in the park, I think were kind of his words at the time. And he identified what he felt 3 cornerstones in terms of developing New Brunswick. One was Johnson & Johnson, and then he said you really had to have something across the street. Albany Street couldn't be the defining line between New Brunswick and J&J and Rutgers. It had to move over. So the concept of the hotel came up, the Hyatt Hotel. And then the third leg of the stool, so to speak, was the cultural center area, with the redevelopment of that, which gave you a foothold a little further down into town. And of course the concept being the multiplier effect of the theater district, bringing people in for the restaurants and what have you. And there had been some pioneers in terms of restaurants and things like that even before the area across the way was cleared at this point. In working with the hotel, the idea was to have Hyatt come in and build the hotel and run the hotel. And
were you involved in the financial dealings there?
I'll get to that a little bit. Sure. So I knew the discussions that were going on, and Jim Burke, who was the chairman, had brought in, was it Pritzker's, I think that was the one, Hyatt, or the family.
That's Hyatt.
Yeah,
right.
Hyatt. And spoke with them about our concept, and they said, well, fine, but we don't really want to build a hotel here. We'll manage it. We don't want to build it.
Right.
And so that was worked out. But when the hotel first went up, it was really a partnership between the city and the company. So the city had a grant. I think it was a HUD grant.
So it was a UDEC
grant. And then J&J put in money, and then there was some borrowing at the time done from Prudential. And over the years, the city asked to pull their money out so that they could then use that in other areas of redevelopment. And then also in terms of the loan with Prudential was repaid, and J&J ended up owning the hotel. So I was in on some of those things at the time. Another person, by the way, you might want to talk with, who was involved a lot at the time, was Gary Goran. Has his name come up at all? It's Gorran. Gary was in our financial group and worked with John on the accounting for all this, and he was a long time resident, I think, of Hyatt Park, but his family owned one of the furniture stores, I believe, that was right here on Nielsen Street in the old days. So he might have some perspective on some of these things. But anyway, the hotel has proved to we weren't really looking at it as a financial return kind of thing, but at the same time, we built it with the idea that J&J could use it. So there were meeting rooms and such, and the space that we had over there, we didn't necessarily have to have when we built the tower and things here. And it turned out to be, obviously a very significant move in the city of New Brunswick. It became a social setting as well as for whatever business use it was or anything of that sort. It became a place where people in New Brunswick could have affairs, whether it was galas of hospitals and what have you. And they said it was important that it moved something across the street, and you didn't have the DMZ. Albany Street wasn't the DMZ.
Was there any other Hyatts owned by companies at that time, or did Hyatt own and run all the other?
I don't know. I couldn't.
I mean, in other words, it was a fairly unusual arrangement, I would think.
I would think so, but I couldn't honestly say whether this was something that was that. The fact that they offered it would indicate that they probably had done this before in some way.
we've heard reference to the Johnson & Johnson, the Credo.
Yes.
Is that, if you can speak a little about that and how,
Right.
the influence of that on the redevelopment. I can imagine the linkages, but I think it'd be good to hear from
Right.
yourself.
Well, the Johnson & Johnson Credo was something that was developed by General Robert Wood Johnson back around, I guess it was in the 40s. And basically what it does is state what the company's responsibilities are to its customers, its employees, and the communities in which we live and work, and then lastly, the stockholders. And the concept is that if you do the first things right, if you're good to your customers, you're good to your employees, you're good to the communities in which you have your offices and such, that stockholders will be well taken care of, and in fact that has happened. And it's really a philosophy that has permeated the company. I came in 1955, and already the Credo was something that everyone spoke about, and it's a way you're supposed to act in terms of business and any decisions you make. I used to say to my people, if you're going to make a decision and in any way it's counter to the Credo, it's the wrong decision. So it helps. It clarifies things a lot. And as you said, one of the principles in there is the responsibility to the communities in which we live and work. And so J&J always not only allowed but really encouraged its people to get involved with the communities. I remember the first thing I got involved in, I was still fairly young, was on the board of the Cerebral Palsy Association here. And over the years, I've still had involvement for one reason or the other. So, but they got you into things quickly. We provided staff to help. We initiated a lot of things, but also supported things that were initiated by others. So it wasn't just a money thing. It was a time and talent thing as well as financial for J&J. And the Credo has always played a major role in not only in New Brunswick, but whether it's a plant down in Texas or what have you, you'll see that they're active in the community. And in more recent years, it's developed internationally a lot more. Internationally, Europe and places like that, because so much of the social services are created through their tax system. There's not that same mindset about contributions and giving, and but J&J has done a lot in that regard overseas. So,
if I can take us back, because
yes.
we were on a good. You had the George Street, the initial office
Right.
building investment.
Yep.
Then the Hyatt being very significant. Maybe if you want to continue on that track of
yeah. Well, while that was going on, other things that I wasn't necessarily involved in on a day-to-day basis, other than from the financial point of view, were as you know, the George Street Theater used to be in an Acme up here on George Street, across from where J&J is now, and a lot was going on in terms of the retail stores and what have you. I mean, one of the reasons for the town going downhill, which was the same at Passaic or Patterson or anywhere, is that you had the malls sprung up there in the 50s, and little by little people just started migrating to the malls, and then started migrating to the towns around the malls, and so the cities were kind of barren. And in the 60s here, you could shoot a cannon down the street at night here and not hit anyone, and it was closed up stores and what have you, and John Heldrich and other people through New Brunswick Tomorrow and things like that, they developed that company. Worked with the retailers, worked with the stores, and one of the first things that went up, which was symbolic in many ways, but it's still there, is the little park on the corner of George and Albany Street. I believe that was the first thing that went up of, I might say gentrifying, but at the time everybody was concerned, is it going to be ruined by tomorrow morning with different people coming in and wrecking the place? But it was interesting. No one touched it. It seemed to be that people knew that there was an attempt here to start resurrecting the city, so to speak. in that regard. And then I know they put in a polling system where every year, every couple of years,
Right.
the Eagleton poll.
Right.
It's about how people feel about the town and what have you, and do that. But so little by little, changes occurred, and it's still a process. It's still a living process. I mean, what started? It's hard to believe that we're talking 40 something years ago that all this started, but it's one of those things that if you don't keep moving forward, you're going to regress. It doesn't stay the same. So the initiatives currently with DevCo and others. One of the areas that was important, I remember, because even after we built, J&J built its new headquarters and such, the area just past the Hyatt was still a very questionable area, and there had been some false starts and such. And
But by Hiram Market.
yeah, that whole Hiram Market area, and moving down, I guess, to New Street or whatever. And there were discussions in J&J. At that time, some management had changed, and people that didn't necessarily have the same history as some of the ones who had started out with this. Some of them did not live in the area. John Heldrich, of course, lived in Highland Park, lived in North Brunswick, and others were involved from a more local point of view or history point of view. So there were discussions, well, how much more money is we're going to have to put into this thing, and so on and so forth. And I remember having a discussion up in the tower and looking down to the hotel, and beyond it was a problem. And some I forget who it was had come in with the proposal that we had to put in another $3 million or $5 million or something like that, and people were rolling their eyes about it. And at what point did we cut this off? And my position always was look, on one side you have Highland Park, on the other you have Rutgers, and on this flank, if we don't do something about it and help in the involvement of establishing something, you don't know what's going to happen. It could regress and what have you. And so we ended up continuing to put some more financing in, and as you can see, the results that got developed, and we moved on with this building and other things along here. So it's been, to me, looking back, it's kind of been a constant process of development, and it's only in recent years really that I felt that Rutgers really got into it. I think with I don't mean from a point of view of supporting decisions and what have you, but I mean in terms of the physical plant, the establishment of the dormitory over by the railroad station, and which I understand quickly became the favorite dormitory,
Right.
and more recently the one here on George Street. It has been terrific because it really got the students in the city much more, and not over across the river in Passaic.
And our building, of course, the Civic Square building.
Well, sure,
Right.
sure. That was one of the big things too, and then there was always that kind of void, so to speak, between Livingston Avenue and Douglas, and by little that's filling in, and you can see as you look at the city how areas are being moved. The plan on the corner of Easton Avenue now, and Somerset, which next to St. Peter's Church, which is going on there. So it's it's just a great story.
Can I get your perspective on the role of the hospital in its expansion?
Well, the
J&J's involvement in that?
Right. The whole healthcare system, so to speak, I think played a very important role because it gave a lot of people, not necessarily living in Brunswick, a reason to keep coming into town. And the J&J was always involved with the hospitals, St. Peter's and Middlesex, which became Robert Wood, but even going and the medical school, because as you know, there were starts and turns and so on and so forth, and it was I think about the same time, and when I had came down to corporate in the early 70s, when UMD&J was officially established as a university, and then went through the kind of iterations of, what kind of medical school should we have in New Jersey. There was the Seton Hall, the Jersey City Medical Center, all these things going on, and so the decision to establish the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School right here in New Brunswick was very important. UMD&J really has 3 medical schools, and the one is the one up in Newark, and then the osteopathic school down in South Jersey. But then Robert Wood being here, which gave a tremendous lift to the hospitals and kind of the aura of higher level, higher tech medical care and such. And
was that Stan Bergen's decision?
Stan Bergen was the head of UMD&J
Right.
from the start of UMD&J for, I guess, 30 plus years.
Right, but I mean, was he instrumental, or he came after the decision was made to be?
No, I think he was quite instrumental in it. I think probably anything that happened relating to UMD&J over those years, Stan had to have it, and he, of course, spent a lot of time in Trenton and what have you with it. And one of the big decisions was by Robert Wood Hospital, made the decision to be the major teaching hospital for the medical school, and so that made a link there with them. And at the same time, it also continued to create some contentious situations with Robert Wood and St. Peter's, and I've spent probably 40 years trying to get things together. And actually, back, I guess around the year 2000 or so, we had a plan for the merger, and unfortunately, the current Pope didn't see it that way, and it didn't happen, and things went back to their way. But the fact is, we do have, with the hospitals and the parts of the medical, the Cancer Institute of New Jersey, the Child Health Institute, the Cardiovascular Institute, things of that type, and that led to the whole the concept of New Brunswick, the healthcare city, and so it played an important role. It also played an important role from the point of view of jobs. I mean, healthcare is a huge job producer, and of all levels, from highest to startup positions, and it's been a great mover, and again a multiplier, as I said, mentioned with the theater. So it's very important that happened. And, I've been involved. I was chairman of the Cancer Institute of New Jersey for actually since its inception, pretty much, and was in on the feasibility studies, and we went from 0 page. I remember people waiting for patients to come in the door, and now they're up to over 80,000 clinical visits a year at the Cancer Institute alone. So very important.
So did J&J must have played an important role then in the improvement of the hospitals and the expansion?
Like with the city, J&J has always been very much involved with the hospitals, not only from a financial point of view, but from the, as I said, the time and talent point of view.
Right.
Many J&J executives have been on the boards of the hospitals, boards of the Cancer Institute, Child Health Institute. They've had leadership positions with those. Personally, have contributed funds to those. Been involved when people are being interviewed for deans or this or that, and so it's been a continuum, really, even before New Brunswick started going downhill. So it wasn't something that suddenly started as part of the revitalization. It was there. And General Johnson, you can go back. He started the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Actually, it was originally called the New Brunswick Foundation back in the 30s. And if you look at where his money went, a lot in those days were for people to get an operation or stay at the hospital or something of that type. So there was always that connection going back. So.
You've spoken about some of the other players. You mentioned briefly Rutgers, I guess. Where was the state of New Jersey in all this?
You know, I had no dealings with the state at all. I think that another very critical, very important link was were the local politicians in New Brunswick. John Lynch, who was involved at that time as mayor, Cahill, who's followed, Pat Sheen, and I mean I could go through a lot of names there, but it was vitally important that the political structure was involved in this, and so that there was a focus on what had to be done and what people wanted to be done, and it really was a great cooperative effort, and I know John Heldrich worked a lot with whoever the mayors were during that period of time, and they deserve a lot of credit for taking leadership roles and doing that.
Where do you see the future of all this going?
Well, as I said, I don't think it's a process that ends. I mean, if New Brunswick is going to continue to grow and be vital, there's still a lot of problems out there. I mean, they may be different from the ones that were here when things started out, but
what do you think some of those are that need to be?
Well, I mean, you have a changing population mix. There's the Latino population now, I understand, is 40-something%, and I don't know how much of that is documented, undocumented, or whatever you want to call those things, but it creates pressures on the social services, it creates pressures on the healthcare services, and those things have to be solved, and different groups have been established in the city to attempt to alleviate these situations, but they're still there. The statistics on with all we have here, with the medical school and hospitals and everything else, the statistics still aren't necessarily the greatest in terms of a lot of healthcare indicators and what happens. So we have a lot to do with that. There are areas of the city that probably still need to be redeveloped in terms of housing and other services. So I'm sure you've probably talked to Chris Palladino and the people at DevCo and what's there on the paper for the future. But retail, I mean, there are retail stores here, but nothing certainly of even medium end to high end, certainly not there. And at night, while the theaters are active and restaurants are active, there's really nothing in the way of bringing people into. You
mentioned with DevCo, and I guess some of the earlier projects, J&J really had to be there for the financing to happen, like on George Street and with the Hyatt Hotel. Did that relationship continue as DevCo has developed many projects over time? I mean, would J&J have a financial role in
the J&J financial role in the project, I think, has lessened. They still make a contribution to DevCo every year and such, and we still work with the principals over there on a lot of things. But they, because of their successes in terms of some of the developments they've had, are able to go out and get financing from other areas, or developers even willing to finance themselves to do what they want to do. So the money pouring in isn't as significant as it was as a percentage. Obviously, its presence here still gives lenders a certain degree of confidence that you have X thousands of people coming in here. And in some of the plans that are being talked about, for example, the development that's going up across from the Heldrich Center and next to the State Theater, where they're talking about another high-rise mix, residential business zone. If J&J were to say, okay, we need space and we'll take X floors of that, that would be a huge commitment. And I know they're working on that. So things like that are more prevalent than
so it's the
dollars.
presence, maybe some commitment to space, but not that immediate level of
Not enough
financing
funds.
and negotiation
Right.
that you had to have done early on with George
Right.
Street and the Hyatt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there were...
Maybe even this current complex, because I guess that also was an early effort.
Right, right. Yeah, J&J's always had someone in charge of property, so to speak. And back years ago, when John Heldrich was still over there, the people reporting to him on that were very much involved in terms of even like going back early 70s when I went to Boston or something like that to help with the financing. So we always were involved. And because J&J has space needs, and that enters into, if you look at 410 George Street on the corner there,
It's the
or
golden
this
triangle.
yeah, right. Or this building, actually J&J owns it. So there's still a big footprint, but it's not a it's not a bear hug kind of thing by any means. I mean, J&J wants to see the diversification of investment and such, and other companies coming in and doing things. And I know DevCo's talked to a lot of the financial services companies and things like that about Brunswick's kind of an ideal site. You're right on the main line, and you're into New York, and yet housing's a lot less, and so on. So it's still very much part of the involvement, but not as much from the hard cash kind of thing up front. Doing that.
Other than, of course, continuing to support New Brunswick tomorrow.
Yes,
and,
right.
But less so in terms of husbanding the financing of the projects.
Right.
Which you have.
Right.
Hindsight. we all have 20/20 hindsight.
Monday morning
and
quarterback.
Things could have been done differently.
It's a hard one. I mean, from my viewpoint, the things that occurred kind of speak for themselves with the success of what's been there. And could you have gone back and say, maybe we should have done this, done that? I would have liked it if we could have gotten better cooperation with the hospitals, for example, and not end up with one hospital having University of Medicine Dentistry in Robert Wood as their medical school, and the other hospital having Drexel University their medical school as theirs. I mean, things like that. But when I look back at that, it wasn't for the lack of trying. People really did work on it. They really did try to do it. So the fact that it failed wasn't something that we overlooked or what have you. I guess probably others who were more in on the ground floor when we were moving businesses around or selling things or buying things or what have you would have the people who were in on that in the 60s or early 70s from actually working with the people here. And whether various segments of the community felt they were shortchanged or what have you, I don't know.
Like some of the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, well, I've read articles, over the years where people who were activists and all, and they talk about where J&J is now and how what a nice old section it was. And all. Well, the fact is, it was a terrible site. I mean, it was rundown buildings and small businesses that were actually relocated to a lot better places than they were. I don't think there were any permanent people living there to speak of, and so people like to romance sometime that there was a bohemian neighborhood or something, but it wasn't. So you do get things like that come up, and I'm sure that people honestly feel that shouldn't have happened, or that in making way for some of the buildings, some historic areas are down, and I sympathize with that, and where we can save those things as part of the structure, we should. I happen to be involved now with the campus ministry at Rutgers with the Diocese of Metuchen. They had a building over on Main Street, I guess it is, which was getting kind of run down and such. And I had first got involved because of a lead gift I had given to the diocese, and we talked about rebuilding, and got to discussions about it, and then the idea came up. You have St. Peter's Church, which is a historic federal landmark, and actually, if you walk out the front door of St. Peter's Church across the street, it's the same view somebody had in 17 whatever of Rutgers. And if you face St. Peter's, the left side is the convent that was there when St. Peter's School had nuns and all, and was deserted. And so we got to talking. We said, here we have this historic site, historic building and such. Rather than rebuild a house on Main Street, why don't we refurbish the convent and turn that into the campus ministry? And that's what we've done. And in October, we're pretty well going to finish and then have a grand opening and all at the end of the year. And we were able to sell the Main Street property back to Rutgers and use some of that fund. So things like that, I like to see done, and I can't give you specifics of other places in town maybe that could have been done or something when they were redeveloping, but I'm sure probably that did happen.
Was J&J involved at all in any financing as it related to housing?
I don't know
with the
any.
memorial homes coming down and relocating.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I think that was through HUD or whatever those. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that was mainly.
The HUD Hope 6 program.
Yeah. Right.
That one was right.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think so. In that sense, that we were involved.
I guess wearing your financial hat, the J&J investments in New Brunswick.
Yeah.
Good financial investment, or.
Oh yeah, I think it was great investment. My feeling was that, I mean, this is J&J headquarters, and you want to have a community that people are proud of. People can go out at lunchtime, that they can easily get to in terms of transportation. And that's another area. Well, I digress, but I think transportation is something that still is on the hopper as to what to do with George Street, Nielsen Street, and so on and so forth. Obviously, Route 18 was a huge project, but the center of town, the parking, and all those questions are still part of what's going on. But from the point of view of Johnson & Johnson. I think that whatever has been put into the community is a benefit to the community, but also it's a return to J&J. I mean, I don't know if another person you might want to talk with is Kurt Whedon. Does that name come up?
Yeah.
Kurt. Back, we had started. Well, J&J always gave contributions out and stuff, but it was kind of an ad hoc kind of thing, and back in the 70s it was formalized, and we set up a committee, and Kurt Whedon was brought in from the outside as a consultant originally on it. That's what he did, and he then actually became a J&J employee, and then I don't know, about 10 years ago he left and started his own business again. But he was in on a lot of these things, and but he wrote a book called something like Social Investing, and the thrust of which is that corporations can do good through making philanthropy high up on their list, but also while doing good can get a return from that. And I think that this is a great example of that, where you just
and in fact, some of these projects have been, the Hyatt is a profitable hotel.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
How transferable is what happened in New Brunswick to other urban areas?
Not easy. I think you start with the fact that not, other urban areas don't necessarily have a corporation whose headquarters is in that town, and whose has a philosophy of a creative philosophy, and is doing well enough in its own businesses to be able to partake in you could just pick it up and say it's the wrong number, because it'll keep ringing. Oh no, wait a minute, somebody picked it up.
Okay.
That's good. And then you also have Rutgers, which is a huge influence also in many ways people don't even know about. So you start off with a couple of benefits that a lot of towns don't have. It's also manageable in size. I mean, you can stand up in the J&J Tower and kind of look at the various edges of New Brunswick, so to speak, where if you stand up in Prudential Building or something in Newark, it's all over the place. So I think there's concepts that were used here that would be transferable. But I've also seen with Robert Johnson Foundation, where we make grants to a lot of places, and every year we go on a site visit. And I've been to some places where we put a lot of money into for different reasons, but they're just tough to get off the dime. I mean, you look at some of those places in California where I've gone to, and others that it's tough. And also the other factor is what I mentioned earlier about, I think you had a solid political structure here. I mean, politics is politics, but on the other hand, they did have a focus in it, and they wanted to cooperate and work with it. Whereas you go to Camden, where I think the last 6 mayors or something have been put in prison. I mean, it's tough, and they just have entrenched problems. But it's certainly worth towns coming in here and looking at it and say, okay, what did they have we don't have, but on the other hand, what do we have they don't, and how can we merge these things?
Of course, some of the commitment of individuals is
Absolutely.
talent of individuals, and it's been mentioned to us of the fact that some key people lived nearby and
Yes.
still they would go back to church in New Brunswick. Do you think that was a factor?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, I think it was a factor that John Heldrich and I and others had lived, if not in New Brunswick, in proximity, so that we were in here and in here, and a lot of people did still go back to church in town and things of that type. And Ralph Voorhees and people like that. New Brunswick was their place, and a lot of them, there are more Rutgers grads at J&J than any other college, and they have that connection too. So that it was another reason to be coming back. I mean, and I've heard from Rutgers grads who graduated in the 60s and haven't been back, and suddenly come back for reunion. Something they can't believe what New Brunswick looks like with the change. So there was that draw, and even though people moved into the suburbs, a lot of them were close by. I mean, New Jersey, everything is. How long does it take you to get somewhere? Not how far away are you?
Right.
So
Right.
they still came in,
Right.
but I think that has some influence on it.
We did have someone at the blasting school, Martin Robbins, who used to be within New Jersey Transit and Port Authority, who did a feasibility study for a light rail system that would have gone from a little bit past Route 1
Yeah.
to 287.
Yeah, I was familiar with
So now they're, because of the high cost of that, they're all still looking at a bus rapid transit
Right.
system that would go through New Brunswick. But
Yeah.
the problem is George Street is so narrow.
I know. Yeah.
Nielsen Street isn't the main street, but
We've
I
had-
think it's still being worked on now.
Mayor Kale has a mayor's committee,
Right.
and it's from here it's John and myself and heads of the hospitals and Dick McCormick and J&J rep and such, and every once in a while we meet and get an update, and we had that
Martin
presented
came-
to us at
yeah.
one time about that.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Had it been done years ago, it wouldn't have cost us much.
I know.
Of course.
Well, we all have 20/20 hindsight.
That's right.
Right.
Woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Right.
You've been very kind in mentioning some people that we should contact. Any other names come to mind, or where there are documents we can look at? I guess we should be talking to the foundation.
Right.
Yeah,
Bill
well,
Walsh.
Bill Walsh would be a good rep from the foundation, I think, and then from the guts of a lot of little things that were going on, Gary Grant would be good.
Now, where would we find him?
We can, John Heldrich's secretary would have
Oh,
his
okay.
phone number.
Okay.
Phone number now. He's in Florida most of the time, but he comes up quite a bit, and
Okay.
I know he'd love to talk about some of this
Okay.
stuff. And of course, that's why obviously Dick Sellers, but it's probably not too feasible at this point.
Right.
Although I guess you heard at one point he put up his stock as his personal support for the theater.
The
district.
State Theater, yeah. Right.
And
Kurt
Jim Burke,
Whedon?
unfortunately, has I guess it's Alzheimer's starting. Not in good shape.
Is Kurt Whedon somebody?
Kurt Whedon, definitely. My secretary can give you Kurt's
Yeah.
phone
That
number.
sounds interesting.
Kurt's good. He was in on the social side of it, and in fact, the day they first talked about the healthcare city concept, it was he and Steve Schroeder, who was then head of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I think Hal Paz were having a meeting or something, and that came up.
Actually, I think someone mentioned that with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, of course, its focus is health, but it can also invest in New Brunswick, on a non-health related.
Yeah, what we do, a resolution was passed by the board a number of years back, and basically we said that whatever monies that the foundation gives out each year, 3% of that will be directed toward New Brunswick and the greater New Brunswick area, which could be Princeton if they're building a new hospital. So that has been a tremendous source of funding here in New Brunswick, and supporting like the Cancer Institute, Child Health, and some of the things I mentioned before, but also the Chandler Center and the two hospitals, and even smaller thing. I mean, smaller grants like the Cerebral Palsy Association or things like that. So, and that's amounted to prior to the market turning down.
Right.
But they put out. We've been giving out $300 to $400 million a year. So 3% of that, is $9 to $12 million a year that flows, and
So that 3% commitment is somewhat of a reflection of the credo.
it is, yes, right. Even though the foundation,
Is that right?
even though the foundation is entirely separate from the company, the philosophy pervades that. And if you go back to when the foundation was set up and formalized, and look at some of the things that went on at meetings and what have you, it's the same philosophy. General Johnson.
Hmm.
And social issues, he was really ahead of his time on a lot of things.
Anything we haven't covered that?
I think so. I think I made a few notes as we were
And
on my other sheet. But
if something hits you at a later
Yeah.
point in time,
right, or vice versa, if you
we're,
want
Right.
we're easy to reach.
if you want to clarify something.
Well,
Right.
let
me
me
know.
thank you for your time.
Yes.
And,
No, you're welcome.
also your many years of involvement. In it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, still at
It's
it.
been great.
Well, I guess
Right.
the fact that you're here.
Yeah, that's right.
That
Right.
tells
Well,
you.
JJ
Yeah.
is, the fact that they've furnished an office and support and
Mhm.
everything.
Yeah, it's great.
Means you can do so much more.
Yeah.
If you try and do something like this out of your house, it would have been impossible.
Right.
And, but because I've been active with Fordham too, so.
Oh, okay. That's great.
Well,
Yeah,
sure.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks
very
for doing
much.
this. I think it's going to be great.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
We'll have-
we will share with you, there'll be a written transcript
Mhm.
that you'll get, and then you can get the audio,
Yeah.
visual, whatever.
I don't see myself
Okay.
anymore.
Yeah,
But as we collect all this and see whether we can get any further funding for, whether it's a publication, John would love to have an exhibit in downtown New
Yes,
Brunswick.
yeah.
I think
That this could be part of as well,
Right.
but that's further
I
on.
can see us excerpting portions of each of the
Yeah.
the visual,
segments, yeah,
slicing
right,
it,
Right.
Yeah, that you could
then
go in and
I think a booklet or something. It's appropriate.
Yeah,
It's
right.
appropriate. Because if it's just there, then it's just in the archives.
No, right. And people just
and
don't.
then you have 5 people.
Yeah.